Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. And here, making her screen debut, is Mildred. There she is. Somewhere here. Yep, there she is. Yeah, look. There she goes. That's Mildred. Lured up here by some snacks. And there's Finster, also lured up there by some snacks. And they'll probably have a fight over the snacks. Well, they're so much cuter than I am. You can watch them while I talk. Hello there. I was asked by one of you to give a list, which I'm always happy to do, of symphonies in cyclical form. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Now, I kind of did symphonies in cyclical form. Let me squish down here a little bit. I did symphonies in cyclical form in a video of prequels and sequels, or sequels and prequels. There's a whole playlist of them. And the work in question was the Franck Symphony in D minor, which is, of course, the iconic symphony in cyclical form. So we'll talk a little bit about some works, and I've got 12 of them here, and they're really very, very interesting. But the main question is, what is cyclical form? Thank you, Mildred. Okay, that was that. Now I'm back. Okay, I know they're the stars, and you'd much rather look at them than me, but we do have to talk about music at some point. So, what is cyclical form? Cyclical form is a way of unifying a large piece of music by having themes or motives recur throughout its various parts or movements. It was a wonderful way in the Romantic period to unify a large work after the classical system of tonality, which had hitherto been used to create this sense of organic cohesion, had basically vanished. Romantic composers were operating under a slightly different harmonic system, and one of the things that they had lost, because it was a broader harmonic system, saturated with chromaticism, which means notes from outside the normal key. And when you weren't operating with the limited key system of classical works, or the key relation system, which is really the better way to think about it, because everybody used the same keys. They weren't limited in the sense that, there were certain keys they couldn't use or didn't use or stuff like that. What they did was they had a system of relationships between those keys. And by exploiting that system, you could create a real sense of dramatic movement through time, as you know from Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and others. And you could also create this feeling when you leave and return to your home key that you'd gone on a journey and it was coming to an end. It had this satisfying unity, and that unity existed both within movements and between movements. In the Romantic period, where immediacy of emotional effect was rather more important than questions of form, at least for some composers, the idea of bringing back themes, having them being within themselves representational of certain emotional states, and bringing those emotional states back in movements to give yourself a satisfying conclusion or feeling of cyclical unity. Get it? Cyclical. Was very attractive. And so a lot of composers wrote works in cyclical form, the iconic one being Franck's Symphony in D minor, where all the tunes from all the movements pop up in the finale. Now, that it doesn't have to be that obvious. Cyclical forms had existed for quite a long time. They really had. And so I have here a list of a dozen things, including the Franck, which we'll get to in a minute, that I think sort of fill the bill. And they do it in various different ways. Composers are ingenious, especially the best ones, and that's who we're talking about here. And so it's fascinating to listen to how they do it, how they use cyclical form to give these pieces that unity. The first is the oldest, a fascinating piece that most people never think about, but it's one of the earliest examples of true cyclical form, and that's Boccherini's Symphony in D minor. This is from the 1770s, I think. I mean, it's old. It's almost pre-classical. It's early classical, but it is in genuine cyclical form. It's Opus 12, number 4, if you really want to know. And it has a subtitle, so thank God, so we can figure out which one it is. The subtitle is La Casa del Diavolo, the House of the Devil, which is a mean, it's a great subtitle. It's juicy, isn't it? Now, how is this piece in cyclical form? It has 3 movements. It begins with a long, slow introduction, and that long, slow introduction is repeated identically at the beginning of the finale. So that's your simplest version of cyclical form. Take a big chunk of music, play it at the beginning, and play it again at the end. Now, after these long, slow introductions, they're introductions, you get a quick movement, then there's a slow movement, then there's another quick movement, which is based on the music of Gluck, which Boccherini knew quite well because he played in Vienna when Gluck's ballet, The Stone Guest, or Don Juan, was premiered. And Don Juan, as we know, ends with the gates of hell opening up and demons popping up and sucking him down into the nether regions of the inferno. And for that, Gluck composed an amazing, he called it a chaconne. It was a passacaglia, some variations over a repeated bass line, which it sort of is and sort of isn't, but it doesn't really matter. It's fast, it's exciting, it's demonic, it's just thrilling. It inspired Mozart hugely for Don Giovanni. It inspired Haydn in his 80th Symphony. It inspired everybody. And Boccherini basically lifted the whole movement, which later became, by the way, the Dance of the Furies in Gluck's Orfeo and Eurydice. I mean, it was... he knew he nailed it with this little piece. And so the finale of Boccherini's symphony is based entirely on this piece by Gluck. But before that, we have a cyclical repetition of the symphony's introduction, which reestablishes the mood of doom and foreboding. So it's a wonderful little work, about 18 minutes long. Go listen to it. If you don't know it, it's really fun. So after that, we skip 1 billion years and we get to the Franck in 1888, which is the, like I said, iconic work in cyclical form. And it became the model for virtually all the French symphonists who came later. It will be hard to find a French symphony that's not in cyclical form. The symphonies of Magnard and Roussel and Dandy and Chausson, all those people are in cyclical form. And so we don't have to talk about a lot of them. I only chose one proximate one. There's a couple more things sort of controversially coming later. But for the moment, Albert Roussel, his Symphony No. 3. Now, like I said, all of his symphonies are in cyclical form, one way or another. But the third, I think, is one of the most interesting. It's his most popular symphony. It's characterized by extraordinary rhythmic energy and brevity, and it has a cyclical theme. That theme is really a motive. It's quite short. It's that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's at 5 notes. And you hear it in the middle of the first movement. It becomes the main thematic substance of the slow movement. Ya-da-da-da-da. It's really very, very beautiful. And so, you hear it there, and it's also in the scherzo, and it ends the whole symphony. And that's how the cyclical process plays out in Roussel's third. But you can listen to it yourself, and once you've heard it 50 or 60 times, I'm sure you'll be able to parse it out in your own mind, and it will become more familiar to you by the moment. Then we go into the middle of the Romantic period, one of the most interesting works in cyclical form of the whole period, Dvořák's Symphony No. 5. Now, I've talked about this work extensively. I wrote a paper about it that actually got published. It really an amazing piece in cyclical form. The opening idea da 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 comes back at the very end. But in the meantime, there are all kinds of relationships interiorly between the movements. For example, the opening of the finale is the theme of the slow movement, played upside down, or inverted, as they say. It's really, really cool. And the more you listen to it, the more you hear. It's not cyclical form in the more obvious Franckian way, where every single tune has to come back. It's cyclical form in terms of the unity of the melodic material through shared motives, which are manipulated and varied in certain ways. That's another kind of cyclical form. And it influenced Brahms, without a doubt in my mind, in creating his own third symphony. That's what my paper was about, because Brahms' third is also in cyclical form. the cyclical form in Brahms is the opening motive. The opening theme, actually, the opening motive, da, 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 there's like an octave thing there. I mean, it permeates all the movements. But the thematic cyclical bit is ya-dum, bum, ba-da-dum, which opens and closes the first movement. It's the principal theme and reappears in the finale. But also at the very end of the symphony, closes the whole symphony. But the other thing that's cyclical about this Brahms piece, which is really, really cool, is that in the middle of the slow movement, there's this really spooky motive. Da, da, wom, wom, da, 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 like that, sort of, maybe a little. And that is a prominent motive in the finale. It comes back very, very clearly. So you can hear that aspect of Brahms' cyclical procedure. And Brahms was not always a cyclical guy. The first symphony has a little bit of it in the finale. The introduction to the finale recalls a bit of the first movement for a moment before the big horn tune comes in. But you begin to spot these things. The definition of cyclical form is a fuzzy one, and you can make it as broad as you like to take into account different kinds of thematic and motivic procedures, or you can use a more limited one. And I stick to the more limited one, otherwise it becomes meaningless, fundamentally, which is repeated themes and motives, which are obvious and which may vary a little bit, but which don't change their shape all that much. I mean, you can turn them upside down or right side up, but, essentially. So after Brahms Symphony No. 3, let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 5 of them. So our Schumann Symphony No. 4. Now, Schumann's fourth is a fascinating piece. I mean, he had a lot of trouble with it. He wrote it twice and changed it a lot and reorchestrated it. Some would say not for the better. But he ultimately asked that it all be played as one continuous movement. It begins again with a slow introduction, which has a motive, a motto that occurs in all the movements, but it's not a very distinctive one. It's not like a catchy tune. It's more like a feeling of movement, da, 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 da. It sort of like rolls along, but it becomes the thematic substance of the slow movement. And then in the middle of the first movement, you get the big motive that everyone uses. Bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. That's dum, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. That's it. And it's the substance of the scherzo. Da, 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 dum. Bum, bum, ba, bum, ba-dum. It's the same thing, spread out a little with some notes in the middle. And then it is the actual main theme of the finale. Cha, 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 chum, ba-dum, bum, bum, chum, ba-dum, bum, chum, bum, 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 ba, ba, like that. It's like real chupa, chupa, catchy. So Schumann's fourth is a major cyclical work, which was probably inspired by one of the great cyclical symphonies of the early Romantic period, which is Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony. That is really, really cool. I mean, this one has got some amazing thematic transformations, like the theme of the scherzo, which is the actual cyclical theme of the first movement, and then it comes back in a triumphant peroration. It's in a minor key originally, and it becomes a heroic march at the end of the finale. A heroic march which inspired another very cyclical piece, which is Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, which is not on my list, but I have to mention it because the influence of Mendelssohn's Scottish is huge on pieces that came later, because of the way that he manipulates his principal cyclical thematic idea. So give it a shot and enjoy your cyclicality or cyclicalliciousness. Yes, it's cyclicalicious, absolutely. Then we turn to Bruckner, good old Bruckner. Bruckner is always cyclical. Bruckner always brings back, or almost always brings back, the main theme of the symphony, the thing that it opens with, or something at the end. You hear it obviously in Bruckner's third, which some of you mentioned in another talk quite recently, but I chose Bruckner's fifth because, it's so cyclical. It's just unbelievably cyclical. You hear at the beginning of the finale all of the themes from the previous movements, which recalls a certain very famous work by Mr. Beethoven, which I can't mention because I'm not suitably attired. I mean, you have to wear a tie, but, let's just call it Beethoven's Last Symphony. You know what I mean? And it does that at the beginning of the finale. And then you've got this crazy fugue with all kinds of stuff mixed up until this enormous chorale erupts at the end. And the theme of the first movement, da 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 ba comes flying back in for the triumphant conclusion. And it's just wonderful. And it takes forever. But the interesting thing about it in Bruckner's Fifth is that, as Joachim said, nothing happens till the very end. You sit there for an hour and 10 minutes, and then all of a sudden, it's all unified. Very, very cool. Enormously cool. Then moving back into the 20th century, here's one that most people probably don't think about as a major work in cyclical form, but it is Howard Hanson's Romantic Symphony. Oh, it's a wonderful piece. First, you've got the big tune, which occurs in every single movement. Ya da 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 da, ba do 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 ba da da da. Oh, note the octave displacement. It's just thrilling, and so that big yummy lyrical tune pops up throughout the symphony, but also the very opening of the allegro is the opening of the finale. Ba da 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 ba ba ba. That's the finale version. The first movement version is da 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 da. It's the same thing. Same thing, just reimagined, and the whole piece is fabulously unified. Some people have sort of criticized it for just that reason, because he can't let go of the big tune. It keeps coming back, but it's such a great tune. We don't care, do we? It's wonderful every time we hear it. Another fascinating example of cyclical form is Elgar's Second Symphony. Now, the first symphony is also cyclical in many respects. It has a huge motto theme that pops up at various points, particularly at the very end. But the second, I think, is a little bit more subtle and more interestingly done. It has a motto, which, because Elgar's English, he has to quote like a poet or something. There's always got to be some verbal something if you're an English composer. And the verbal something is from Shelley, I think, isn't it? Rarely, rarely comest thou spirit of delight. And that spirit of delight is a very, very simple da 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 da. It's right at the beginning. It's a fragment of melody from the main theme, just a fragment. And it occurs regularly throughout the symphony. But the really cool cyclical element is the relationship between the first movement and the third movement, the scherzo. Because in the central development section of the first movement, there's a tune which Elgar associated with an evil influence wandering through the garden. Of course, it's the sex part, because in English music, sex is always evil. And so you've got the sexy, luscious, sensual, attractive, evil, hypnotic theme, which is, yada, yada, da, yada, da, 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 da. Gee, wasn't that sexy? Anyway, it's really sexy, trust me, the way Elgar wrote it. But then, in the middle of the scherzo, the third movement, it comes soaring in the violins in the most gorgeous possible transformation, which suddenly becomes evil. It becomes a throbbing, vicious, pulverizing climax with slashing strings and menacing trombones. Oh, it's so cool. My goodness, that's cyclical form used not just for unifying purposes, but in the service of a real emotional program, because this theme has been lurking throughout the first movement, and it only reveals its full malevolence in the scherzo. Oh, it's so much fun. Now I have a couple Frenchy things, because sort of the logical extension of the Franckian model into other realms, which are symphonic. And, symphonies in all but name. Well, one of them is, but one of them is not. And the one that is not is Debussy's La Mer. Now, La Mer is a three-movement symphony. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's a three-movement symphony. It does all the things a symphony is supposed to do. It does not have movements in sonata form. Okay, no. I get that. But it has cyclical form. Lots of cyclical form between the first movement particularly and the finale. And the cyclical bit is the chorale that comes in at the end. Da 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 dum da da ya da da ya da da, that thing. And actually, it's sort of related to the opening theme of the, do 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 do. It's very, everything's related to everything else. But it comes back as a triumphant chorale at the end of the finale, after appearing quietly in several passages as well. After that first big climax, it's do 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 do. And so Debussy uses cyclical form to create a symphonic sketch. He calls it, 3 symphonic sketches or something like that, La Mer. There's a subtitle or something. And it really is. It's symphonic by virtue, at least in Debussy's mind, of its use of cyclical form. And you hear it in all of Debussy's multi-movement pieces. It's also true in Iberia. But La Mer is the iconic one. And it's clearly cyclical, and that clearly gives it a at least a qualification to be considered a symphony, a symphonic work. And last but not least, we have Messiaen's Turangalila-Symphonie, the Tarantula Symphony, the Turangalila Symphony, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't make any difference. Now, this is in 10 movements. None of them are in traditional forms. The fact that it's cyclical is the only thing that holds it together. And Messiaen has quite a few themes that he identifies straight off as being the basic material for the whole work. One is called the statue theme, which is a bunch of block chords on the brass, blah, 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 like that. Another is called the orchid theme, which goes do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do, like that, and the woodwinds. And then finally there's the love theme, the big, yummy, da, 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 da. I can't even do it. That's no point. There's the love theme that populates several of the movements. And with this material, Messiaen constructs the whole work. Sometimes it occurs literally. You hear it exactly the way you did originally. And sometimes it's actually reworked in terms of a developmental kind of thing to become the thematic material of the entire work. For example, if you listen to the 5th movement, The Joy of the Blood of the Stars. Oh, it's so much fun. It's based on the statue theme. If you follow the statue theme, you hear it, especially in the central kooky section where everything's going crazy. You hear it very clearly. And it occurs at the very end. Finally, as its original self. So you can think of it when it appears as, aha, the logical outcome of all that has happened before. So the Turangalila Symphony, thank you. By the way, that means cosmic love, death, play, Sanskrit, star, cosmic creation, destruction thing. It's very, very helpful. So the Turangalila Symphony is probably as extreme an example as you're going to get of a symphony in cyclical form. Now, there are numerous programmatic symphonies in cyclical form where the tunes actually represent people, things. I mean, there's the Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz. There's Harold in Italy, because there's, in the Symphonie Fantastique, there's his girlfriend. She's a theme. There's Harold. He's a theme. And so they return. And so those are also in cyclical form. But I'm talking about works that are not programmatic here. In other words, that don't tell a specific story. Because if you tell a story, you have characters. And those characters will have themes. And so if it's in multiple movements and telling different parts of the story, and those characters appear in the different movements and they're part of the story, then it's cyclical. So you've got Scheherazade, you've got all the Berlioz stuff, you've got Tchaikovsky's Manfred, you've got Liszt's, Faust Symphony, you've got Sibelius's Lemminkainen Legends in a subtle way. There's many, many ways to do cyclical form. But we are talking now about abstract music that tells a story of emotions, principally, but not a linear narrative in terms of events that occur with specific characters who have themes associated with them. That's a different kind of cyclical form. So there you go, friends. I hope you've enjoyed this little chat, and that maybe you'll listen to some music that you haven't heard before, or if you know it well, you'll listen to it with fresh ears. The important thing is to keep on listening, and take care.